So, thank you all for joining us. My guest today is Father Dwight Logenecker, a Catholic priest, speaker, and author of numerous books, including The Romance of Religion and, most recently, The Mystery of the Magi. Father Dwight Logenecker has been outspoken on the subject of spirituality in modern American culture, and his articles have been featured in numerous publications, including First Things, Pathos, and The Imaginative Conservative. Father Dwight Longnecker blogs at dwightlongnecker.com and podcasts at Triumphs and Tragedies. So thank you, Father, for joining me today for this interview. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So I have a lot of questions to ask you, but I think perhaps the first question for an audience that might not know a ton about Catholicism, it might surprise a lot of people to hear that in addition to being a Catholic priest, you're also the father and head of a Christian family. Can you explain your journey into the Catholic priesthood from Protestantism through the Anglican ordinariate?
Yes, I just need to correct that a little bit. I'm not actually in the ordinariate, but
Oh,
some
okay.
of some of your listeners might not even know what that is. But so I'll explain.
Excellent.
Over the years, ministers from the Anglican Church, that's the Church of England and the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion, have made their way to the Catholic Church for various reasons. And I came into the Catholic Church in the mid 1990s, when the church. I was a priest in the Church of England, and I was married with two young children. And what had happened was, in the late 1970s, a group of Episcopal priests wrote to Pope Paul VI, asking if they might be ordained as Catholic priests, even though they were married with children. They had found out that in the 1950s, Pope Pius XII had received a group of Lutheran pastors from, I think, Denmark or Sweden into the
Mhm.
Catholic Church and allowed them to be ordained as Catholic priests, even though they were married. And the reason this could happen was because the discipline of celibate priesthood is a discipline in the church. It's not a doctrine, and a discipline is something which the church has the authority to change. And
Mhm.
so Pope John Paul II received this letter, this request from Episcopal priests in the U.S., and set up something called the pastoral provision. And that is a special process by which former Anglican and sometimes Lutheran and also sometimes ministers of other denominations who are married, who come into the Catholic Church, can be given a dispensation from the vow of celibacy, allowing them to be ordained. So I'm in
Mhm.
that situation. And the Anglican ordinariate is something set up by Pope Benedict XVI to expand this provision, allowing Anglicans to come in, whole congregations to come in and to maintain Anglican styles of worship, liturgy, music, and so forth, and have kind of like a church within the church. So that's what the ordinariate is. I'm not actually a member of the ordinariate because I came in before all that was established. So I'm a priest, an ordinary Catholic priest in the
Mhm.
Diocese of Charleston in South Carolina. But as you said, I've got a wife and children.
Okay, excellent. And you've had a very long spiritual journey. I think was it originally from Protestantism?
Yeah, I was actually brought up as an evangelical Christian, and one of my one of my sort of claims to fame is that I actually am a graduate of Bob Jones University,
Oh,
and
really?
yeah, and if people are familiar with that world, Bob Jones is kind of like was anyway in my day the most extreme of the fundamentalist Protestant colleges. You know, they were very anti-Catholic,
Mhm.
and I'm afraid to say in the early days they were racist as well, and um, so I went to Bob Jones in the 1970s, and so my journey from there to becoming a Catholic priest is pretty unusual.
Well, do you have any key moments or spiritual developments that led you to your current understanding of God and the church?
Yeah, when I was a student at undergraduate at Bob Jones, I was an English and speech major, and therefore very interested in English literature. And I came down with a terrible disease called Anglophilia.
I think a lot
And
of people have caught that one.
yeah, I know. So I was, really captivated by T.S. Eliot and C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, all these writers.
Mhm.
And so while I was at Bob Jones, I actually became an Anglican in a little Anglican church in Greenville, South Carolina. And I'd also met a very simple and devout Catholic woman who befriended me. So when I felt the call to the ministry, I obviously wanted to go and do this in England. So I got accepted
Hmm.
at Oxford and went to do my theology there and became a chief priest in the Church of England in England. So I lived over there for 25 years and married an English woman. So that journey was really a journey towards history, towards the historic church, towards the church that had its roots in Western culture, its roots in Western history. And as a friend of mine said, the trajectory from Bob Jones to Oxford was not likely to end there, but it continued eastward to Rome, and that's what happened. It was this attraction to Western culture, Western literature, and the roots of Christianity in the Western culture, which then led me to Rome as the kind of fulfillment of all of that. So I've always said my journey was not away from my evangelical upbringing. It was adding more to it. And indeed, one of the books I've written is called More Christianity, which is an explanation of the Catholic Church for evangelical Christians, a friendly way of saying, look, what you have is good, but there's more to it than that.
I mean, being a sort of convert myself, albeit from atheism, I have a lot of Protestant friends who have become Catholic very recently because
Hmm.
they have, well, in my words, been searching for deeper roots. They've been searching for, in some sense, a heritage that goes back more than just one generation or includes more than just a personal relationship with
Yeah,
God, but actually is something that's more collective. Do you think that plays a part in it?
yeah, I think so. And when you look at American Christianity critically, as Ross Douthat has done in his book Bad Religion, it's a terrific book. He does a critique of American Christianity. The subtitle is called "How We Became a Nation of Heretics," and Ross goes through and analyzes American Christianity and sees that it's actually very superficial and very wedded to modern American culture. And so a lot of Christians are, young Christians too, I feel, are looking beyond that and saying, look, what we have to have something which is transcends the culture we live in, something which is deeper and older, something which is has some deep roots. Otherwise, the tree will be blown over in every storm that comes along. And so
Mhm.
that was really the destination for me, and I think it's still a valid reason. You know, people look around at the Catholic Church and say, "Oh, why are you kidding me? Pedophile priests and corruption in the Vatican and whatever." And sure, we see all that, but we see beyond that to the deep roots in spirituality, in culture, and in art and literature, architecture, all these things which the Catholic Church has given us, and we want to plumb into that.
It seems like the Catholic Church might offer some kind of collective way to relate to holiness or a collective way to relate to the historic witness of Christians and Christ's church.
Yes, I'm actually very committed to a traditional form of liturgy. I'm not totally committed to the Latin Mass as such,
Hmm.
but I am committed to um, the riches that it gives us because with a traditional liturgy, we actually have the opportunity to unite from all of our different uh, cultural backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds and our tastes, and to unite in something which is much older and much deeper and much richer than we are. Going to a traditional celebration of the Latin Mass or traditional celebration of the Catholic Mass, I should say, is to not just view these things as one goes into a museum to view, old paintings or stuff.
Hmm.
Uh, it's actually to participate in your daily life, in your regular life, and to participate in something which is as old as the Roman Empire, and even older because of the roots back into, of course, the Hebrew religion, another 2 or 3 thousand years old. So this is, for me, increasingly a great strength.
I know. I witnessed. I go to a parish that practices a traditional mass, although not Latin, and it is something that feels very living. It feels very real. It doesn't feel like some kind of toy, and I think that's something that people are really craving. It seems in the
Yeah,
modern
I
world.
mean, I mean, think what's actually going on there. I mean, it really is pretty awesome. Here I experienced this last summer when I went to Florence. You go to Florence and you go to the Uffizi and you go through and you see all these beautiful religious paintings which are on the wall of a museum. And any museum that you go into is going to have a
Mhm.
pretty big section of Christian art because the art of the Middle Ages and then the Renaissance is predominantly Christian. And so you go in a museum and you experience all these paintings, you see all these pictures, and you say, oh, wow, that's pretty neat. And you maybe after half an hour, you've got sort of what I call museum zombie state of mind. You know, you've
Yeah,
seen
yeah.
so many pictures, you're zoned out. But then you go into the great churches in Florence, like the Church of Santa Croce or the Dominican Church, and here you see these same artworks in the location that and the architecture for which they were designed. And if you go to mass there, you're actually experiencing the drama of the mass and the life of the mass alive today in the architecture, in the surrounded by the art and the paintings for which it was intended. My gosh, it is a totally different experience than wandering through a museum with your guidebook.
It's living culture, right?
It is. It's living culture. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, so this is a longer question, but it's sort of related. So I said I was a convert of sorts, and when I say of sorts, I mean that I had an extended family that was, dreaded word coming, culturally Catholic.
Uh-huh.
Now, it's long been a feature of the modern Western Catholic experience that it seems cultural Catholicism occupies, in many ways, a larger footprint than individuals who devoutly practice their faith. How do you think this is going to evolve in the modern world, especially in light of a recent event that I saw you blog about? The recent event being Ireland's decision to legalize abortion through referendum. Do you think cultural Catholicism is entering a crisis, or is cultural Catholicism dead, perhaps?
Well, first of all, it's good to put this in context. So this is one of the reasons I'm doing my podcast, Triumphs and Tragedies, which is a little history of the Catholic Church. 20 episodes, basically 1 century per episode, looking at the history of the Catholic Church and Western culture. And when you go back to the early Middle Ages, you really see the flowering of what could be called cultural Catholicism with the Pope Leo the Great, and then Gregory the Great, and then Hadrian and Charlemagne. By the time you're talking about the fourth, fifth, and sixth, seventh, and eighth centuries, you're now moving into a time where Christianity has been adopted by the Roman Empire, and then the Byzantine Empire, and then by the Lombards and the Franks, and it expands across Europe. And with the Holy Roman Empire, with Charlemagne, for instance, the Pope crowns the emperor, and there's this blending of politics and religion, of culture and religion. The Benedictine monasteries are spreading across Europe, and Christendom is this expression of the Catholic faith in the Middle Ages, which is total cultural Catholicism. Everybody was Catholic, you
Hmm.
know, and it was healthy and it was strong. But of course, we then move into the age of first of all the Protestant Revolution, and then the French Revolution and the Age of Revolution, in which cultural Catholicism becomes beleaguered and fortified. And you find that it exists, nevertheless, in certain pockets very strongly, where the national identity becomes fused with their Catholic identity. So we're talking about places like Spain, especially in Poland and in Ireland. These pockets of Catholic identity become merged with the cultural identity in a unique nationalistic way, not in the way that you saw in Christendom, where all of Europe was Catholic. And indeed, there was a loyalty to the Catholic faith which transcended nationalism. Nationalism grows up along with the Protestant Revolution, and you find certain nation states which therefore are Protestant. This brings in the Hundred Years' War, and there's all the clash there. But in Ireland and in Poland and in Italy and Spain and France to a lesser extent, where there's lots of cultural upheaval and revolutionary upheaval, you find this cultural Catholicism. But what happened was that as modernity comes forward, cultural Catholicism becomes so melded with the culture of Ireland and Poland and other places where it's indistinguishable. When they come to America, of course, after a few generations, when they stop being Irish or Polish, they also stop being Catholic. So yes, cultural Catholicism is dying out.
It's funny because I talk to a lot of atheists and new atheists on my online blogging career. I just
Hmm.
attract those sort of people. A lot of them are coming off of their late 20s new atheism, Richard Dawkins phase, and they're looking to embrace some kind of cultural identity. And the most common question I often get from these ex-new atheist types is it okay for me to be culturally Catholic? And I'm always struggling to answer that either affirmatively or negatively, because it seems like saying yes or no, neither seems correct, I guess, right?
I think I don't know what they mean by that, but I suspect they mean bicultural Catholic something different than I'm talking about.
Just to clarify, I think they mean that they want to embrace the culture, the ethics, the lifestyle, but they haven't reconciled themselves to the theology yet, I guess.
Yeah, in other words, this is like Jordan Peterson. I'm reading his book at the moment, and he's very interesting cultural phenomenon because he's kind of like that. You know,
Yeah,
he
exactly.
wants to take on the so-called mythology of Catholicism. He likes the sort of depth of Catholicism and the way it connects with world culture and with psychology and all that. And
Mm.
I understand that, and that is very attractive. And it would be nice to be able to dip your toe in Catholicism like that. And I would just warn anybody of G.K. Chesterton's statement that once a person starts being fair to Catholicism, it's not long before they're attracted to it. And it's true. And you start realizing when you dip your toe in Catholicism that everything is connected. And you might appreciate the ethics or the values of Catholicism or the psychological depth of Catholicism or let's say its cultural roots and in the arts and architecture and literature and so forth. But then you start realizing that actually this is all connected to the Mass and to
Mm.
Catholic worship and beliefs. And it starts becoming a little bit of a roller coaster if you're serious about it.
Yeah, and it seems like you have to become serious about it at some point if you're going to be truly culturally Catholic. To be culturally Catholic is to be serious about the faith that inspired it.
Indeed, and that starts impinging on your lifestyle because you start saying, well, if I'm really being serious about this, is it aren't I being a hypocrite by living with my girlfriend without being married? And if I'm really serious about this, um, am I being truthful and honest about perhaps my financial irregularities or what
Mm.
other things in my life which are inconsistent?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you mentioned Jordan Peterson because I think his phenomenon it seems to indicate a turning point in our culture, perhaps a crisis of it. Do you think that there's some type of spiritual crisis going on in the modern world, perhaps? Or I don't know. What do you make of Jordan Peterson?
I'm on the one hand, I'm kind of jealous of Jordan Peterson because he is able to. I'm also, you see, because of my background in literature, I'm also very interested in Jung and in psychology and the thought of Rene Girard
Mm.
and the connections with Catholicism, with the deeper aspects of myth and culture and symbolism and all of the stuff. Because I see it all lived out as I celebrate Mass as a priest, but I'm kind of jealous of Jordan Peterson because he's able to do stuff as a psychologist, which I can't do as a priest right now because there's a lot of prejudice about priests.
Oh yes,
They,
yes,
they
absolutely.
assume that maybe we're all kind of dumb, or we have too many sexual hangups, or I don't know, all kinds of prejudices about Catholicism and priests. Jordan Peterson's able to come in as a psychologist and speak wisdom to people, and begin opening up the avenues into myth and into psychology and into human relationships and to the metaphysical and to God and all this great stuff because he's a psychiatrist and psychologist, which I feel intimidated by because I have these prejudices against a priest. But I think they can be overcome. In fact, my next book project is called The Return of the Warrior Priest, and I'm going to be
Ooh.
examining the origins of evil in society, touching on Rene Girard's thought, but also touching on the deeper aspects of what is sacrifice and what is this ancient religious practice, and how do Catholic priests do that, and what does it mean to be a priest? What does it mean to be a sacrificial person in the broader sense? In what way is one a warrior in all of this? Not a selfish warrior, but one who's campaigning against evil. So I'm hoping that I might be able to touch some of those same chords.
Do you think we've lost part of that sort of militaristically spiritual tradition that you see so prominently if you read medieval literature or really anything from before the Reformation?
Yes, there was a tradition of the Catholic knight, who is a person of great integrity, who is, a very manly character who is nevertheless wading into the battle against evil and with very high standards and a great morality. And I think this was actually part of our culture right up through World War II. The World War II generation, those young American men who hit the beaches in D-Day, I guess I shouldn't romanticize it too much and be too influenced by Saving Private Ryan, but but I think they set out with a sense of Christian morality. Most of them, they weren't perfect, but they sensed that Nazism was a great evil, and that eventually one has to stand up and take up arms against it.
Hmm. I mean, they seem to be walking in their tradition as something that was far older than they were, certainly. I would imagine that this type of manly virtue would be common in, say, the charge of the Light Brigade, like the Crimean War, or even in older times.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the tradition goes back, for instance, to the Flying Hussars, the cavalry
Mhm.
who came down from Poland at the Battle of Vienna with General Sobieski to King Jan Sobieski to overcome the Muslims at Vienna. There was a great sort of valiant crusade about that in the best sense. Interestingly, if we're talking about culture and literature, fans of Tolkien, who will remember the great charge of the Rohirrim at the Battle of Gondor will be interested to know that Tolkien was actually inspired by the Battle of Vienna and the Flying Hussars for that
Mhm.
particular scene. And Tolkien actually had an ancestor, he believed, who fought at the Battle of Vienna. So there's a nice little connection there with European history and this kind of ideal.
It's amazing how much that's not in the consciousness of either the modern American or modern European. I know I happen to be lucky enough to have a Polish priest or two Polish priests in my parish, and so I certainly have heard about Jan Sobieski. But I think that in the modern consciousness of any Westerner, even one of Austrian or German descent, this older world that we hear about from these stories is not very present in their identity or their consciousness of who they are.
Yeah, and I think the horrors of the First and Second World War have made people so terrified of any kind of militancy, but also the ambiguous and messy wars that America has been involved in the last 50 or 60 years. You know, Vietnam and Korea and Iraq and Afghanistan. These are messy wars, and they're ambiguous, and we're not sure whether we're righteous warriors or not. And people are frightened, therefore, of that militancy, and so we've taken refuge. In what I call being crybaby bullies. We this kind of thing about being a victim has overtaken us. So instead of being militant warriors, we become crybaby bullies, pumping ourselves up as being victims and the term snowflakes and so forth. That's the way we do militancy now. We go around complaining and grumbling and protesting and blaming other people and being crybaby bullies. And I think people are tired of that.
What's not to like about it? It's essentially war without any risk.
It's war without any risk. It's blaming others. It's war without any sacrifice. Yeah, it's that's why I call it crybaby bullies. It's immature, spoiled brats who are stamping their foot and slamming the door.
It's great you say that because I'm going to move on to the next question or perhaps set of questions. So it seems to me that America and perhaps all of the West in the 21st century is suffering from a kind of identity crisis. I noticed this in my own life that this identity crisis has been very pronounced among young white men. Quite recently, you wrote an article on the skyrocketing white substance abuse problem and suicide rate in the United States. Do you think there might be a connection between the lack of some coherent identity available to men now and these growing misfortunes that we see in Middle America and other poor communities?
Yeah, it's huge. It's kind of like a perfect storm. There's so many different factors are contributing to this. One of them is, for instance, increased mobility and the disintegration of the family and the extended family. Not too long ago, well, in my father's generation, he was born in 1927. People would have grown up and married within a sort of tri-county area, and everybody was from the same ethnicity, the same religion, and you could have driven at least maybe a 20 or 30-minute drive to visit your uncles, your aunts, your cousins, your nieces and nephews, your grandparents on both sides. And You grew up and you were nurtured within this extended family. And so increased mobility and increased education has dissolved all of that. In addition, the breakdown of the family through no fault divorce and promiscuity and sexual revolution have also broken all of that. So a lot of us are, as you say, totally stranded and we don't know who we are. We don't know where we belong. And with the disintegration of religion as well and increased doubt about organized religion, another one of the props which helped to support people has been taken away. And so young men and young women for that matter, but the young men, as you've brought up that subject up, are alienated. They're alone. They are despairing. They're nihilistic, and that eventually leads to despair and violence against themselves and others. So this has also been exacerbated by feminism and homosexualism. And I use the term homosexualism to distinguish the homosexual inclination from homosexualist ideology. These two ideologies have also called into question the masculine identity and what is a man? What is a woman? And we're very confused about these things.
That's a hard question to answer. We don't seem to have an answer for what is a man, in particular in the modern world.
Well, I have an answer.
Yeah, let's yeah. Well, so what do you think? What do you think is the Christian answer for that, or the Catholic
Well,
answer? In
I would pose an answer by posing another question. I would say the question you just asked, what is a man?
Mhm.
What is a woman? And I would say, how can you define that without saying that a man is a father or a potential father? A woman
Mhm.
is a mother or a potential mother. That's what our biology tells us. That's what our drives and instincts tell us. That's what history tells us, that a man has certain equipment which enables him to be a father. A
Mhm.
woman has certain equipment that enables her to be a mother. Therefore, a man is a father or a potential father, and a woman is a mother or potential mother. We used to know this. We used to understand this implicitly from everything around us, from biology to our families to our religion and everything. But of course, the sexual revolution, artificial contraception, abortion, feminism, homosexualism have deprived us of those very basic human definitions. And therefore, we're confused about it.
It seems that men want to either be physical fathers or they want to be spiritual fathers. They want to bring something forth, and women sort of archetypically want to nurture something and be a support. And perhaps here we can find identity, but I don't think you're going to find any kind of description of this in our contemporary academic or cultural sphere, certainly.
No, we're running away from it as fast as we can. In fact, we're doing everything we can to try to destroy it.
It's kind of strange when you look out into this into the world that you see culturally these days. A lot of people on the internet describe it as clown world because everything seems sort of surreal, as if we've sort of entered an alternative timeline, as if this wasn't the future people were really imagining for themselves.
I wrote an article for Imaginative Conservative a few weeks ago, which is called the Disneyland Dystopia.
Hmm.
And I said, look, we're actually living in a culture where we use surgery to augment our bodies in a Frankenstein kind of way. We are paying doctors for women to have bigger breasts or bigger buttocks, for men to have bigger penises, to have faces which are younger than we are, and to do all sorts of modifications. And then we also are paying doctors to chemically modify our children and then surgically modify them to change them from boys to girls and girls to boys. This is Frankenstein stuff. Furthermore, we are supposed to celebrate something called surrogate pregnancy, where homosexual men artificially inseminate a woman who's a stranger who they pay to carry a baby so that they can have them, or another situation where a woman keeps her reproductive organs but changes in every other way so that she can be a man in order so that she can be a man with a beard who's breastfeeding her child. I mean,
Hmm.
this isn't some future dystopian novel. This is America today. This is America today.
You're talking about these things, and I'm shocked, but I've almost grown accustomed to it.
This is what we do, and and it's all plastered over. I call it Disneyland dystopia because it's all plastered over with smiling, smug, America with its Disneyland mentality, where everything has Mickey Mouse ears and a perfect orthodontics, and I just find it nightmarish.
I think the interesting question is perhaps how did this occur? How did this happen? I mean, we've had weird movements erupt in the West before, but it's only recently that we've seen to have gone into this cultural tailspin, so to speak. Do you have any theories on this?
Yes, and this is again why I'm doing this history podcast and why I encourage people to study history. The roots of it actually go back 400 or 500 years with the disintegration of our culture, but it's also has to do in America specifically with the rise of individualism as a kind of alternative religion. And along with individualism goes relativism. In other words, the prevailing religion or philosophy in our culture is it's it's the theme of one of the burger joints. I forget which one it is, which says "Have it your way," and
Yeah.
that's the main philosophy, that whatever you want to do and whatever you think you can do, you must do. And don't get me wrong, there's lots of advantages to that. The kind of thing of dream your dream and do it. That's a great American ideal. And in many ways, it's fantastic. It's allowed us to be great entrepreneurs, great inventors, to create this wonderful technology we have, which has enabled so much learning and so many good things. The medical technology, which has brought about so many good things, and increased healthcare and health provisions are fantastic. But it has its shadow side.
That's very good because it segued me directly into the next question. So, when you talked about how this totally individuated and autonomous view on right and wrong impacted us and sort of drove us to this strange cultural moment that we now occupy, I immediately thought of one of the most interesting books that I've read this year, and that's Patrick Denon's Why Liberalism Failed. So, I don't know if you've read the book, but the author makes the point that a lot of these concepts of liberty, especially totally autonomous liberty that came about in the late 19th century and obviously originated in the Enlightenment, naturally and deterministically lead to this kind of complete cultural disintegration because nothing can sustain pure individualism for long. Do you think liberalism, quad liberalism, has failed? And if so, what do you think a solution or a replacement might be?
Well, the great Western tradition has always balanced individualism and individual liberties with other virtues, which are things like obedience, a sense of duty, a sense of commitment, in which one's individualism is submitted to something greater. And I'm actually a Benedictine oblate, which means I follow the
Hmm.
way of the Catholic faith according to the rule of Saint Benedict. Saint Benedict was a monk in the 6th century who became his rule became the foundation for Western Christendom. And one of the aspects of the rule is the vow of obedience. Now, obedience is sometimes is always denigrated in our culture as being kind of, oh yeah, you Catholics, you're just robots, whatever the Pope says you do. Well, of course not. True obedience is rooted in the Latin word obedere, which means to listen. And therefore, someone who's obedient is listening very attentively, listening to the wisdom of the past, listening to the philosophies and the truths that have stood the test of time, listening, in my case, of course, to the teaching of the Catholic faith and the wisdom of the saints and the wisdom of Jesus Christ down through the ages. And so one listens and then submits to this. And we accept this in every other discipline. We accept that if you want to be a great athlete, you have to listen to the coach and
Hmm.
obey the rules. We accept that if you want to be a great artist, you have to listen to the teacher and obey the great tradition. If you want to be a great actor, you have to train and listen to the great tradition and train in Shakespeare and train your body and your voice to attain great things. If you want to make $1 million, you have to do your homework. You have to train and listen to your bosses. You have to see how this is done and follow the patterns and submit yourself to the great tradition. But for some other reason, when it comes to philosophy and religion, we think that, oh no, you can just make it up as you go along. And so, yeah, the answer to this radical individualism is to submit to what I would call the great tradition.
What you just said there sort of reminds me of, was it Alistair McIntyre's book After Virtue? I think a
Yes.
lot of people have been questioning whether a return to virtue is possible in the modern culture. Have we come too far? I don't know. It seems that a lot of people, even people who, like myself, who would desire sort of a return to these virtue ethics that you're talking about, it seems like there's some barrier in the way.
Yeah, it's the barrier has always been in the way, the barrier is that I would rather pursue short-term pleasure than long-term gain.
But do you think there's
And
something particular about the modern culture we live in? A lot of people seem to think that there might be, right? There might be some special barrier of this age.
yeah, I think the barrier in our age today is this the evil of relativism. We don't think that there is actually an objective value system or objective right and wrong, something which has a demand on us which is greater than we are.
Hmm.
And this has been undermined because Christianity has been kind of poo-pooed and undermined, and therefore any idea of an objective value system which comes from beyond ourselves and is greater than ourselves has been dismissed through atheism and relativism. But the Christian tradition says that actually this has been given by God, and it's actually a set of values and rules which have been given by a greater source than we are. And it began with the Ten Commandments, and it's filtered down through the Judeo-Christian tradition as something which is not easy, but is possible.
I think that there's a hunger to see examples of that in the modern world. But from both secular and Christian people, I think that we really want to see heroism, but we're almost too cynical to believe in it, or I should say, spiritual heroism. Obviously, not action heroism. We see that every day in the movies, but there's sort of a hunger to see a saint that we can believe in.
But these heroes are all around us. I mean, Pope St. John Paul II, if you read his life, here is an amazing spiritual hero, somebody who survives communism, survives Nazism, becomes a priest in secret because the day that he was actually being ordained, his best friend, who was going to be a priest as well, was taken out by the Nazis and had a bullet put in his head. I mean, these are fantastic and amazing heroes. You think of Father Jerry Popozescu in Poland, who was martyred by the communists, and you think of the modern martyrs today in the Coptic martyrs under the Muslims, or someone like Mother Teresa, who was a living martyr. These heroes are all around us, but we have a hesitancy to be drawn to them because they're religious. But we should acknowledge that these heroes are driven by their Christian faith, and that's what makes them so courageous.
And I think perhaps with some help, they could also become more real to us, right? I think that we're so isolated from people who live their lives on principle that oftentimes hearing about someone like Mother Teresa, one of my friends would go, "Oh, well, that has to be concocted. It has to be a PR release. Someone couldn't possibly live their lives like this."
Yeah, but this is where people don't take enough time to actually explore it. I went to El Salvador on a mission trip, for instance, and you can go and visit the very simple three-bedroom apartment where Archbishop Oscar Romero lived a life of complete simplicity in identification with the poor who were being taken out and murdered by the right-wing regime. And you can then go across the street and actually visit the church and stand at the altar where he was gunned down while he was saying Mass. I mean, these are within living memory, people who did actually live heroic lives of virtue right up to the point of death. And they're there for the picking if people want to have a look at them.
Coming down onto our final set of questions, it's great that you mentioned the fact that you followed the rule of Saint Benedict, because it reminded me of the other book that I read this year, perhaps equally controversial to Patrick Denon's Why Liberalism Failed, and that was Rod Dreher's The Benedict Option. Rod Dreher is a blogger and someone who's spoken a lot about the culture wars we face in the modern world, and in particular how people of religious devotion can react to those culture wars. Now, I've read the book once, and perhaps I should read it twice, but if I'm to summarize it, Dreher seems to be calling for some kind of sequestering of Christian communities away from a poisonous modern overarching culture. Do you see some kind of solution in this, in what he's describing, the fact that we need to have tighter knit communities that are in some sense withdrawn, although I'm not sure he would use that particular word?
Yeah, actually, Rod's a friend of mine, and
Oh, great.
Yeah, and he's not actually calling for that as much as he's calling for that to be an underlying mentality of the communities which develop. And I think what he's describing is something which is going to happen naturally, but also intentionally. In other words, it's a wave that's coming in, and there will be people who actually choose, like surfers, to get up and ride it. What he's basically saying is, look, increasingly those who are committed to a traditional historic Christian faith, whether they're Catholic or Orthodox or evangelical, are going to be forming families that are intentionally living a particular way. They're going to be following a Christian sexual morality. They're also going to be following, if they can, an economic morality, and they're going to be educating their children and themselves in the great traditions. And just by doing this, they will stand apart. They will be different, and that individual parishes and communities will begin drawing those kind of people together because they're going to say, we want to be with other people who are doing this. My own parish in South Carolina, in Greenville, South Carolina, is an example. We are situated in a poor and needy part of town. We have a little parish school, and increasingly we are attracting families who have a large number of children because they're living according to a Catholic sexual morality, and they're coming together to worship. We've built a beautiful traditional church. Our school is going to offer a classical education. And we're not sort of saying everybody outside this group is sort of horrible, dark sinners and we're the only elite. Everybody's welcome to join us, but we're just coming together because this is what we believe and we think it's a joyful, wonderful way to live our life. And we believe that communities like this will eventually prosper. And just as it was in the early church, when the decadent Roman society looked at the Christians and said, actually, I want to be like them. They seem to be happy people. And I think this is what's going to continue to grow. And I feel optimistic about it.
I think the fear is that there's going to be pressure coming from the secular world to crack down on institutions of a counterculture or counterculturally Christian perspective, as we've seen in some places like Canada, where Christian colleges have been decertified due to specific beliefs about marriage and life that run contrary to what the government would like to put forward in its own educational institutions.
Right, right. And if that happens, then the Christians who believe these things will say, okay, we don't need to be certified. We'll continue. We'll have another college over here. We'll start one and we'll continue to share our life. Thank you very much. And people will say, my kids who don't have a degree from a certified college, they're doing really well. They've started their own business. They've gone into a trade, or they've gone into some other aspect of life where they've started their own business. They've been entrepreneurial. They've prospered. And you look at communities like the Amish, for instance, who've always done this. They've said, you can keep your certification, you can keep your government regulations. We're farmers. We grow our own food, and we're happy out here in the country. So again, I feel positive about it. And if people therefore are disengaged from the secular culture because the secular culture rejects them, these are the kind of people who are smart and entrepreneurial and happy people. It'll be fine.
No, I think that's great. I think optimism is in such short supply among people these days that it's great to hear a perspective that says that we can do it. And that's one thing I did enjoy about Rod Dreher's book. I think it gets painted, perhaps unjustly, as being a testament to pessimism. But I think actually, and I don't know the guy like you do, but it seems like Mr. Dreher is probably very optimistic, more optimistic than I am, and I probably could learn from him in that regard.
No, Rod is pessimistic about secular society. He's actually very, very critical of it in his book. But Rod is not saying, "Oh, apocalyptic times are coming. We need to hunker down and go into a little mountain fortress and grow a beard and have our own chickens." He's not saying that, and he's stoutly against those kind of charges. He's saying what I'm saying is that to live a Christian life in a Christian community intentionally and according to the ways of our tradition, which are positive and good and powerful. He's saying this is the stuff that built Christendom. This is the life and the philosophy from which all the great cathedrals came and all of the great achievements of Western Christendom came. So let's do it again.
Well, I really like that sentiment. I think probably there are a lot of people, both secular and Catholic, that could learn from that. So since we're coming up on time, I have one final question. So, although Father Logenecker is very accomplished in the subject of spirituality and politics in the culture war, and has written extensively on those topics. My personal favorite article that he's written in the last several years has nothing to do with politics or religion or spirituality, perhaps spirituality, I should say. And that's the article, Why You Should Read and Write Poetry. Now, I wanted to ask you about this because it seems like it's such a lost art. So why should we read and write more poetry? And more importantly, how can we bring ourselves or train ourselves to read and write more poetry?
Well, first of all, you should read poetry because it's useless. In other words, it's one of those occupations like laughing and dancing and singing, and the liturgy for that matter, which doesn't have any financial purpose. It doesn't have, I mean, nobody gets rich writing poetry. And so you should read and write poetry because it's useless. And that actually takes you into a realm where you're doing something which you're doing simply because it's worthwhile. You're doing it simply for its own end, because it's beautiful and it's true. But there are also some very practical things about writing and reading poetry which are terrific. You know, I'm a writer and I suppose a thinker in a way about language. And when you write poetry, you basically are switching your gears, your mental gears from practicalities and utilitarian point of view to doing something which is kind of lateral. You have to think outside the box. So if you write, and you must write poetry that actually rhymes and has rhythm and form. You can't just write this free verse stuff, okay?
No slam poetry, please.
Yeah, nothing like that. Okay, so because the writing according to the rules of rhythm and form and rhyme forces you to think outside the box. So let me give you an example. Let's say you're writing a poem and you're searching for a rhyme, something that rhymes with the word sense. And immediately you are looking, you come up with incense, or you come up with fragrance, or you come up with incensed, and as soon as the rhymes make you see a different angle on the meaning as well, and so you start coming up with different rhymes. G.K. Chesterton said, I think, thinking is making connections, and writing poetry makes you make connections in ways that you wouldn't before, and this is a creative thing. It gets you thinking outside the box, and it also therefore gets you thinking about life and truth and reality from new perspectives that you didn't perceive before. And this is a great thing. It's a kind of mental agility, which therefore makes you a better thinker in many other ways. And it also gets you out of prejudices and biases and all those trammeled ways of thinking, which lead to bigotry and prejudice.
Do you have any particularly favorite poets that got you into poetry writing and poetry reading?
Yeah, I just knocked free verse, but my T.S. Eliot's my favorite poet. But T.S. Eliot was grounded in the forms of poetry. He could only write the free verse because he did his hard work to get there. It wasn't undisciplined. It was very disciplined poetry. But Robert Frost and Philip Larkin, the new poets of England from the post-war period, are especially inspiring to me. But the new formalists as well are encouraging for me.
Yeah, are the new formalists a phenomenon of our own time, or are they earlier?
Yeah, of our own time as well. Modern poets who are writing in formal structures are inspiring.
Well, excellent. So thank you so much, Father Logenecker, for coming on the show and doing the interview. I would like to plug your blog and your book. You have a blog at dwightlongnecker.com. The podcasts are Triumphs and Tragedies, and the most recent book is The Mystery of the Magi. So thank you very much, Father, for coming on.
Well, thanks for the invitation. Thanks for some very enlightening questions.